Yeah, what we used to say WASP. It's probably a pejorative now, but way to Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I mean, you know, that was established by John Porter how many decades ago now with his vertical mosaic, right, where he showed that it was clearly the WASP segment of Canadian society that sat on top of the pyramid. Even among whites, you could differentiate within the white majority settler culture. I mean, how those guys dominated, and I mean, they dominate economically, they dominate politically, and they certainly still dominate culturally. I think. I mean, if you draw on Bourdieu's notion of habitus, the Anglo-WASP habitus is still seen as the preferred habitus, the preferred way of conducting oneself.
Which involves certain very basic values that are not shared by other cultures.
That's right.
Such as a high stress on individualism.
Yeah.
And therefore respect of the other, to the extent that you will try by all means necessary not to offend the other person, even if that involves lying and being duplicitous but the paramount value is that you don't you have to subordinate things such as what's actually the case here, what's true to this view. And I mean, this sounds like not necessarily a bad value, because
in some ways
it does give individuals a lot more space than in cultures where the dominant culture is enforced by individuals who hit on the weaker ones or the deviant ones and say, hey, you, how can you say this, or how can you look like this, or clearly to notice that is not to dismiss Anglo culture. There are perhaps other dimensions of it that are more problematic, at least for some people. I guess the basic point is that if you are born into it and grow up in a culture such as Anglo culture, you don't really notice it. It's naturalized.
Yeah.
This is what you consider to be normal, natural, and everything else is different, strange, exotic. And it's in that sense that an Anglo-majority culture can demand that its basic norms be respected in society at large, because you don't really see it as a culturally specific thing, but really as a universal kind of thing. That's the problem with Anglo culture, in part because historically it has been a dominant culture, starting with the British Empire up to the American Empire. And so a dominant culture always, like really any other culture, sees itself as natural, but only the dominant cultures can impose that and say that, well, what we think is really universal, and that's why we're not really pushing you in any untoward direction. We're just inviting you in. But are there problematic aspects, I guess, is the question. I've almost...
You're being awfully generous to the WASP culture.
Yeah, maybe because I'm secretly hoping that by the end of my life I will have integrated into it, become one.
I remember sitting in Germany watching TV in a student residence one time, and we were watching news, and it was somebody from Britain, some British, who was Thatcher or somebody in her cabinet. This is obviously a while ago, and they were making some point, and the German guy beside me was listening, and then he turned to me and he said, "Such liars. It is such a dishonest culture. They lie all the time." And he meant the Brits, because he said they never say what they think, and you never really know for sure, and they would rather lie and pretend there's no problem than admit there's a problem. And so obviously for him, for that German, I assume he wasn't unique, the idea of a culture that has as its norm to smooth over things is not necessarily a universal good. I mean, it limits the room for...
Well, it's also a very strong challenge for any external person to join
Yeah.
a culture like that, because if you're in it, you understand the code,
That's right.
and that not every expression of agreement actually means agreement. I mean that we know that, but if you're coming in from a different culture, you may be very confused
Yeah.
by what people do, and so unless you're prepared
Yeah.
by somebody else who can explain this to you, you're bound to run into quite a few problems and
That's
walls,
right. That's right.
because you misinterpret. And this is an experience I've read about. This is a experience that not only Germans have.
Oh,
but
sure.
That
Cuts
is
across.
fairly,
But it's who pays the price. It depends on where the power lies, right? I mean, you can step into a minority culture and violate all kinds of norms, but there's maybe no consequence because you're from the power culture. And you can just go in. And whereas we do it the other way. But it's true. Meaning always is context dependent, and that's partly by culture. I mean, if this door is open, and you say the door is open, that could be just an empirical statement. But if the door is open, I just walked in and I left the door open, and you turn to me and say the door is open, and then I do this, and then maybe I say better now. Like we've actually had an exchange about norms.
yeah.
It's not actually an empirical statement that you made. The door is open. It's about.
It is not just an empirical
No,
statement.
it's not just an empirical statement.
Yeah. It is actually
That's
primarily a command statement.
That's
or,
right.
or an imperative.
And if I say it's better now, I'm not just inquiring about an empirical state of your emotions. I'm signaling a recognition of a certain, obligation that I felt to do this thing, which maybe I didn't think was completely,
Yeah.
it's pretty multi-layered.